This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Director of the IHR here, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome you all here for what I'm sure will be a fascinating lecture on Bismarck. The day owes little to me, but to one of our senior research fellows, Karina Urbach, who came to me in January and said there was a very important anniversary which had to be noted in our diary. I thought it would be Magna Carta, or Agincourt, or the Battle of Waterloo, or indeed Gallipoli. And as you know, this is a year of anniversaries. Everything seemed to happen on the 15th. And we're engaged here in the IHR in remembering all of these events in sequence. But Karina came and said, no, it was something different. It was the birth of Otto von Bismarck, which I must admit had escaped me. It wasn't one of the bicentenaries I had remembered. But I'm absolutely delighted that we've managed to pull this event together, and as I say, it's Karina's work really that has done this, because it was a life on an epic scale, and it's one I think that we should remember because it takes us back and presents 19th century history, perhaps captures it as a single life, perhaps the only single life in the 19th century really can capture the whole of the 19th century. So I'm going to hand over to Karina, who's going to introduce notable guests, and then I'll introduce the speaker in a moment. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Professor Goldman. We were terribly worried that nobody would turn up today, because when we planned this exhibition, we had no idea that there would be the general election on the 7th of May. And we're really relieved that you did come, and that you're probably interested in something different tonight. We also are very glad that Professor Lawrence offered us these wonderful, recently renovated rooms. And he said to us we could have any room we wanted in the house for the exhibition, but we chose the basement. One reason for that is because everybody has to come down here for these beautiful new toilets. So we knew people would get into this exhibition, would have to walk past our exhibition. You have probably noticed it's a very small one, but since it's the first exhibition on Bismarck ever in Britain, we can claim that it's the biggest and the best. There has been no exhibition before. I think it's very easy to understand it. On the right-hand side, when you come in, you find out everything about Bismarck's life. Most of you probably know the failures and successes of his life already inside out, because you have read Johnson's bestseller on this man. But that's on the right-hand side, the basics. And then on the left-hand side, you can see the impact Bismarck had on Britain, if there was an impact. I mean, nowadays we just remember him as a ship that was sunk. You know, that's what the British would think of, Bismarck as a ship. But no, there was of course much more. And he had a very ambivalent relationship to Britain. We will hear about that later on as well. He loved it, but he said the British don't let you love them. So he admired Disraeli, he had admired Rosebery, but of course there were lots of problems he had with Britain, and the British had lots of problems with him. They were critical of his wars, naturally, not just the military crusades, but also later on his fights with Parliament. But they also admired things about him. Gladstone admired the Kulturkampf, don't ask me why, because that was quite a vicious one, but they admired his social policies, and they admired his personality. And they named the British named a lot of their dogs after Bismarck, which is, in the 19th century, not today, which is a real compliment. I mean, if the French named their dogs Bismarck, that was an insult, right? But in the British case, it was meant as a compliment. So, yeah, Bismarck was loved and hated, but we will hear more about that later. We are very glad that the German ambassador is here with us today, and you probably know that he is the one who can explain German relations to us. There's nobody better to analyze this. He had a lot of great postings. He has been ambassador in France, in Washington, and now here at the Court of St. James. So I'm handing over to Dr. Ammon. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Frau von Urbach, for these kind words. And I can tell you, I'm just coming from another meeting which was packed with British politicians, and I was surprised that in these times they would find the opportunity to leave what they are doing normally and leave home. And I asked one of them, "Why are you here?" And he said, "Well, I try to escape those people who knock on your door at the last moment and want to take you the golden cars." So, thank you very much, Professor Goldman and the Institute, for making this event possible, and thank you all for your interest in Otto von Bismarck. I believe that your interest is due not only to the academic curiosity, but also to the fact that the world today, like in the second half of the 19th century, is going once again through a transformational phase, and the call for political far-sightedness and leadership is almost universal these days. So 200 years after Bismarck's birth, we, of course, enjoy the privilege of hindsight. But unlike his contemporaries, we can today easily say where Bismarck erred and where he was right. We Germans in particular, with our specific vantage point on history, look at the subsequent catastrophes of the 20th century and ask ourselves what opportunities probably were missed in the 19th century, in Bismarck's time at the helm, and later, long after the pilot was dropped. 25 years ago, in 1990, we Germans were given a second chance to live in a united country, although in a totally different global context. We Germans want to play our cards better this time. But there's good reason to ask, what can we learn from studying the historical figure of Bismarck today, 200 years after his birth? Clearly, building a united Germany in the difficult European context of the 19th century and creating institutions fit for the transformational changes in society that came at the time with the Industrial Revolution was not for the faint of heart. Some say that the situation required a visionary with an iron fist, but there was a price to be paid. There are only a few figures in history that have divided society and historians as much as Bismarck has done. As much as he had been admired for founding a united German nation and then preserving the peace in Europe for over 20 years, he has also been criticized for his deep-rooted disregard of the German parliament and for a reckless approach towards his political enemies at home and abroad. Bismarck's handling of the challenges facing him often involved the oppression of his domestic political opponents, Catholics and Social Democrats. I'm sure we will hear more about this. In his foreign policy, Bismarck resorted to tactics that we definitely would not approve of today, the Ems dispatch being perhaps the most notorious example. Keywords such as realpolitik, anti-socialist laws, but also the welfare state, as well as the unification of the German Empire, all describe Bismarck's complex political life and legacy. As I said, it may be a bit unfair to judge Bismarck by applying today's standards in hindsight. I sometimes wonder what verdict future historians will render about us. Is peace in Europe really secure today? Are we prepared to stand up for democratic values? Are we on a safe road towards European unity? Do we have good answers to the social demands of aging societies? And can we cope with challenges that come with the digital revolution? And even if we have all the right answers to these burning issues today, do we have the stamina to win the political battles that are inevitable when societies have to reinvent themselves and implement unpopular reforms? So we may not always agree with Bismarck, but he certainly merits our respect. Ladies and gentlemen, as we have just heard, the year 2015 is marked by a number of anniversaries, from the 70th anniversary of the end of the Second World War to the bicentenary of the Battle of Waterloo. That was my choice. But I believe that the bicentenary of Otto von Bismarck's birth merits a closer look as well. And I'm grateful to you all for bringing this exhibition to London, and to Professor Steinberg from the University of Pennsylvania, who will give us further insights into the life and work of Germany's Iron Chancellor. I wish us all an enjoyable evening with fresh insights into the life and work of a German statesman who, without doubt, left his mark on European history. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, please excuse me before Professor Steinberg just to say a few words about the Otto von Bismarck Foundation, who produced this exhibition and brought it over here. The German Bundestag decided in 1997 to honor the first Chancellor of Germany by creating an independent foundation in his memory. The central tasks of this foundation since then have been scholarly research about Otto von Bismarck and his era, as well as historical and political education. For this purpose, the legacy of Bismarck and his descendants is being preserved, analyzed, and displayed for the general public. Karina Urbach is not only a fellow in this house, but she is member of the scientific board of the Otto von Bismarck Foundation. I am a researcher there. I'm a historian and lecturer at the University of Hamburg nearby. The foundation is situated in Friedrichsruh, an idyllic little village in the Sachsenwald forest near the city of Hamburg. Otto von Bismarck had lived there from 1878 until his death in 1898. The centerpiece of the foundation is the permanent exhibition Otto von Bismarck and his era, which provides visitors with an informative and entertaining stroll through the life and work of Otto von Bismarck, and which illustrates German history in general in the 19th century. Parallel to Bismarck's career, the chronologically ordered exhibition depicts Germany's long road to nationhood and Bismarck's foreign policy for a European balance of powers, as well as central aspects of his domestic policies. Both foreign and domestic policy are presented in a balanced way. Achievements and failures are shown. Those who expect the presentation of a national hero may be disappointed. Apart from the permanent exhibition, a comprehensive archive and library allow a comprehensive study of the man and his time. The Otto von Bismarck Foundation has also been in charge of the traditional Bismarck Museum in Friedrichsruh since a few years, 5 years, 6 years. More than 350 exhibits are displayed there, including Bismarck's study from Friedrichsruh Manor House, as well as the only remaining version of Anton von Werner's proclamation of the German Empire, depicting the sad scene in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. The foundation hosts lectures, conferences, and special temporary exhibitions in Friedrichsruh, Germany, or here in London, in this part, as part of its program of research in historical and political education. It also offers a wide range of educational activities and programs for schools and other interested groups. Ladies and gentlemen, Otto von Bismarck would have been nervous today, and so am I a bit. He wouldn't have been nervous because there are so many English concentrating and focusing on his life, and because there's an exhibition on his life here in London. He was self-confident. That wouldn't have bothered him, I guess. He would have been nervous because of the elections tomorrow. That would possibly have meant a risk of instability in his fragile system of coalitions and treaties in Europe. I'm a bit nervous because the small exhibition about Bismarck in Great Britain, which is one of 3 exhibitions that are shown in the diplomatic hotspots of Bismarck's time. The other ones are shown in St. Petersburg and Paris. Because this small exhibition is to be opened within the next hour. And I do hope that I did not forget too many aspects of Bismarck's life and work. One is Bismarck's fear of the ever-changing prime ministers in Great Britain. That was the main reason why the monarchist Bismarck, who was not responsible to any parliamentary majority, was so cautious and careful when he was dealing with British foreign politics. What he did not know, and therefore could not fear, was his legacy and the significance of his name in the UK, where Sank the Bismarck, we have already heard, Sank the Bismarck, even 200 years after his birthday, is an imperative that is known quite well. Fortunately, nowadays, a bit apart from Navy circumstances, but as I learned, as the name of the pretended strongest beer in the world, brewed in Scotland. This is to come to an end, an alcoholic honor that Bismarck would have loved, I'm sure.
Well, we've come really to the point at which we'll get to the lecture, which is the crucial point, I'm sure. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Jonathan Steinberg to you. I'm sure he's known to many of you. I've known him since 1976. We became friends later, but I attended his lectures fully 39 years ago in my first year as an undergraduate. Jonathan is, I think, the right man to be Bismarck's biographer because he is at heart a true Prussian. He used to lecture 3 times a week. Everybody else lectured twice a week at most. He lectured 3 times a week, Mondays, Wednesdays and Fridays at 9 o'clock in the morning. A true Prussian. But many of us came, and I can assure you that over the year he never lost his audience, and everyone said he was the best lecturer in part 1 of the Cambridge Tripos, and I'm sure they were right. And I remember, I recall something else, because Jonathan gave a set of lectures on Italian fascism. I think it was the first time you ever lectured on that. You told us that you decided you needed to know something about fascism in Italy, and you were going to write a set of lectures and read for them as you went. They were the most exciting set of lectures I think I attended, precisely because we had a lecturer trying out ideas in front of us, very much at the cutting edge, and sometimes stopping and saying, I don't really understand this bit, let me tell you where I've got to in my thinking, and you can help me. That was very exciting to be an undergraduate and being taken into the confidence of the lecturer. And I think some of those lectures, some of that material, went on to become part of Jonathan's acclaimed book, All or Nothing, The Axis and the Holocaust, which looks at the Italian army in this point, in the Balkans, between 1941 and 43. But of course, his greatest work, and the work we're here tonight to celebrate in many ways, was reserved for Bismarck, and its publication 4 years ago in 2011 puts us all in his debt. So it's with great pleasure, the greatest pleasure, that I hand over to Jonathan, whose title tonight is Why Bismarck Still Matters, Thoughts on the Occasion of His 200th Birthday.
Your Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, this lecture in May of 2015 closes the circle of a life's work and reflection, and I want to thank my host, former student and old friend, Professor Lawrence Goldman, the director of this wonderful Institute of Historical Research, for the generous offer that he made to me to give this lecture. If I may, I'd like to correct one observation. Nobody's ever called me Prussian before. It's a category error. How about American neurotic? I also want to thank Dr. Karina Urbach, whose book, Bismarck's Favorite Englishman, Lord Odo Russell's Mission to Berlin, published in 1999, provides a fascinating portrait of Bismarck from a shrewd and cultivated observer. I want to thank her for inviting me to do this lecture and for her friendship and collegial assistance. I also want to thank Dr. Otto Morgenstern of the Bismarck Foundation for the effort and attention they've given to this occasion, for the invitation to take part in the ceremonies in Berlin, and for his help and friendship. I can date exactly, as a good historian should, the first time I lectured on Bismarck. It took place in January 1964, when, as a newly elected research fellow at Christ's College, Cambridge, I exercised the privilege which was then available to research fellows to offer 8 lectures on any subject of their choice, which was useful for the tripos. My series was called Germany After Bismarck. So necessarily, my first lecture was indeed on Bismarck, and I think this is probably my last, so you can say I've been thinking about Bismarck for a very, very long time. Although 51 years separate that event from this, I cannot say that I've finally arrived at firm conclusions about Bismarck the man, as the ambassador I think quite rightly said, love and hate. Though I have firmer views on his contribution and impact on German subsequent history, I'd like to begin by looking at Bismarck the man and the myth which he helped to create and which eventually came to surround him. Bismarck, the wise statesman, who would never have involved Germany in a great war, the Realpolitiker, who was never swayed by emotion, and who understood how to deal with the Russians. And as some on the extreme German right now suggest, they need Bismarck back to deal with Vladimir Putin and not the government that they have. This mythical Bismarck still has some influence today, but not any longer the fierce subject of debate, which used to be the case in the 1960s and 70s. In that sense, that's true that he belongs to history. Bismarck's legacy does matter, but it's subtler and much more profound than the caricature which is offered by anti-EU politicians. Let me begin with reflections on the man Bismarck. He matters today because I believe he was the most complicated, fascinating, and brilliant human being ever to rule a great state in modern times. And he matters because he represents the strengths and limits of our human nature, and because of his legacy to Germany after his death. So first, some thoughts on the Iron Chancellor. Otto Edward Leopold von Bismarck was born on the 1st of April, 1815, on the family estate in Schönhausen, at the core of the old Margravate of Brandenburg. He was the 4th child of Ferdinand von Bismarck and Wilhelmine Mencken, a bourgeois whose father had been the high civil servant. Bismarck was born just before the final convulsions of the Napoleonic Empire played themselves out at Waterloo on the 18th of June, 1815, and he died just before midnight on the 30th of July, 1898, at the age of 83. His life and achievements spanned the entire 19th century and in crucial ways shaped it. He was born into a rural society whose main mode of transport was the horse. And he died in an industrial society of the railroad, steamship, and global commerce. Just before he died, an agent of Thomas Edison actually made a recording of Bismarck's voice, and that of Moltke as well, which was recently discovered, and I believe you can actually listen to it online. He begins this in English with an old English American drinking song, which he must have got from his college roommate, John Lothrop Motley, a Boston Brahmin, with whom he spent 2 years living together. His powerful personality, the ruthlessness and brilliance, his wit and his charm, his ferocious temper, and his need for revenge made him at once loved and hated, often by the same person, admired and feared even by those closest to him. His neighbor and female friend, and one of my 2 favorite informants, Hildegard Freifrau Hugo from Spitzenberg, a truly great diarist, who watched him over many years and recorded him, as once she said, I interviewed him using the English term, wrote what she saw. And in her diary on the 4th of January, 1888, she noted, and I quote, the apparent contradictions in this powerful personality are of such an intense magic that I am bewitched every time anew. Though he was constitutionally head of a royal government, whose ruler was a king and later an emperor, he dominated his royal master, who observed wryly that it was difficult to be emperor under a chancellor like Bismarck. For 28 years, this extraordinary person ruled the Kingdom of Prussia, which he transformed into an empire by provoking 3 wars in 6 years, wrote its constitutions, and established its institutions. If no man is a hero to his valet, we may trust the testimony of his private secretary. Christoph Willers Tiedemann, born in 1836 and died in 1907, belonged to the National Liberal Party in the Reichstag in the 1870s. He was by no means a leading figure, and when he was invited to Bismarck's home one day, he had no idea why. But he did write down his first impressions. And he said, "An interesting day," I quote here, "from 5 to 11 in the Bismarck house. The prince complained about poor appetite. Hats off. I would like to see him once with a good appetite. He took second helpings from every course and complained about ill treatment when the princess protested energetically against the enjoyment of a boar's head in aspic. He sipped the wine, but drank lots of beer from a huge silver tankard," unquote. Tiedemann became Bismarck's private secretary and adjutant. And it's worth thinking about the fact that in 1875, Bismarck had been in power for 13 years, fought 3 wars, unified Germany, and he'd done it all without a personal assistant. His literary production is gigantic. The original edition of Bismarck's works, the official edition of the 1920s and 30s, is 19 volumes, quarto sized. Each one runs to about 500 pages. The new Friedrich-Ruhe edition, which Morgenstern and his colleagues are putting together, is a fantastic scholarly achievement, but it's likely to be twice as big as the old one, at least. And I must say I've used quite a lot of it, and you will benefit from seeing it in this lecture. On one occasion, Tiedemann wrote in his diary that Bismarck dictated for 5 hours without a break. No no ah, nothing. He had in his head the whole 32 pages of a report that he wanted to give to the king. Tiedemann worked at this pace for 5 years, and when after one day in 1880 he got a formal invitation from his wife inviting Herr Geheimrat von Tiedemann to come to tea at the family address, dress informal, he'd come to the conclusion that he ought to go home and spend some time with his family. He thereupon submitted his resignation, and Bismarck never forgave him. I'm told that Helmut Kohl did the same thing to Horst Tausig. When you get to that level of power, it's a privilege to work for them, and they should know it and not go away. But Tiedemann was a very, very shrewd observer, my second favorite observer. And he did, after he retired, what he called dissectio animi, a dissection of the spirit of the most remarkable political figure of the 19th century. And I want to just quote a few things. First of all, Tiedemann described his physical appearance, his tall frame, his broad shoulders and great arms and legs, his high forehead and brilliant, expressive eyes made him a really impressive figure. After the victories of the Wars of Unification, the Kaiser gave him an honorary rank of general in the Magdeburg Cuirassier. And Bismarck told Tiedemann it was wonderful because he could wear that uniform and he never had to worry about celluloid collars and cuffs and buttons again. He had, according to Tiedemann, no personal vanity. He never cared what he looked like and could not be bothered to sit for portraits, and on one occasion when he had to wear civilian clothes and a high top hat, he looked so ridiculous his wife forbade him to wear it. He was unusually gifted with unusually full and rich eyebrows. And I'd like to quote a little bit from Tiedemann's diary about the significance of these. If he was excited or nervous, he tended to fiddle with the hair of his eyebrows the way some men play with their beards. When that happened, you had to reckon with a day of first-order difficulty. If I came in and noticed that the prince had on his face a melancholy, world-weary expression, he was staring out the window and twisting his eyebrows, I knew that a storm would burst at any minute. I would raise an insignificant matter and usually got the answer, don't care, do what you like. End of quote. He reworked his speeches and lectures with the care of a great writer, and he was, I think, one of the masters of German prose. One of the great pleasures of studying Bismarck. He never wrote a dull sentence, his style was magnificent, and the reminiscences, though not very reliable, are brilliant. It took 3 days to find the phrase, the honest broker, which he used to describe Germany's position at the Congress of Berlin in 1878. When he went to the 2 parliaments in which he made speeches, he rarely had a fully written script and would speak with his natural charm and brilliant prose and enchant everybody. There's one little anecdote which I quite like from Tiedemann's diary. He was holding forth in 1880 on the accession of Hamburg to the Zollverein, to the customs union, and he noted that the visiting ships were stopped 4 times on the Elbe before they got to Hamburg. Tiedemann slipped him a note and said, they do the same thing on the Thames, 4 times they have to stop. Bismarck built it instantly into his text without showing it, and afterwards he said to Tiedemann, where the hell did you get that? He had incredible mental abilities, really totally recall memory, and the capacity to see the key importance right away. And I want to give you one wonderful example from Tiedemann's diary. This was about a long-forgotten Austro-German trade treaty in the late 1870s. Herr von Friedberg had come, who was a relative of Dr. Urbach, who was then Minister of Justice, to present the deliberations of the Prussian cabinet, and they were deadlocked. Tiedemann presented the issue, and this is the quote. After I had finished listing the main points of difference between the 2 states, the Prince, without pausing to think, replied as he peeled a hard-boiled egg. I quote Bismarck. Answer to 1, I shall make this concession if absolutely necessary. Answer to 2, wouldn't dream of it. Answer to 3, that has to be left to later agreements. Later, Friedberg took me on one side and said, what kind of a man is this? In Berlin, we debated for 6 hours and could not arrive at a conclusion. And here the matter is settled in 6 minutes over a boiled egg. The most famous example, I think, of Bismarck's instant decision-making occurred in 1878. And this, I'd like to read this because I think it's the most famous passage from Tiedemann's diary, and it tells you a great deal about Bismarck. It's in 1878. Quote, as I was underway to the Almühle and Friedrichsruh Park, I caught sight of the Prince, who, accompanied by his dogs, and they were always Great Danes, gigantic dogs, was walking slowly in the bright sunshine across the field. I walked towards him and joined him after a brief greeting. He was in excellent humor and chatted about his walk and the beneficial effect which a long walk in the forest had on his nerves. After a short pause, I said, some very important telegrams have arrived. And he answered in a joking tone, and they're so urgent that we have to deal with them in the fields? Yes, I replied, unfortunately they are. They contain shocking news. Another attempt has been made on the Kaiser's life. This time, it has hit him. The Kaiser is seriously hurt. With a jolt, the prince stopped. He drove his gigantic oaken walking stick into the ground, and taking a deep breath, as if a mental lightning bolt had struck him, then we dissolved the Reichstag. Only afterwards did he inquire about the details of the assassination attempt. Now, to understand how brilliant that is, you'd have to know the situation in which he found himself. He was being pressed by the National Liberals to take him into the cabinet, and in an instant he saw an election, a security issue. An election like that would go conservative, and he would be rid of the National Liberals forever, and that was correct. Tiedemann noticed the contradiction between his incredible, relentless ego, his power drive, his division of mankind into friends, regarded as servants, and enemies, all political or administrative opponents regarded as scoundrels or idiots, with a total absence of personal vanities. And I want to read this passage because I think it's very characteristic. He considered every kind of vanity as a sort of mortgage on its bearer, and reduced the person's value by the exact amount of the burden. His folio in the great mortgage ledger of human beings was in this respect absolutely blank. There can be very few human beings who cared so little for outer appearances, were so indifferent to, and placed so little value on rank, station, precedence, or etiquette. He yearned neither for recognition from above nor applause from below. End of quote. And I might add also, all visitors to Bismarck's house, political opponents or not, were always overwhelmed by the great courtesy and kindness with which he met them, even though his tolerance of opposition was pretty close to nil. And after a cabinet meeting, he exploded, "If I want to eat a spoonful of soup, I have to ask 8 jackasses for permission." I think that's pretty funny. He tended to brood on opposition in sleepless nights and repaid many insult or pinprick with a dagger. His capacity to hate was unlimited, and his view of human nature very jaundiced. Tiedemann once asked him, "Did I sleep well?" And he said, "Ich habe die ganze Nacht gehasst. I spent the whole night hating." Now, this remarkable human being did an enormous amount of damage to Germany and to his enemies. He was, I think, not really very anti-Semitic, but he was certainly capable of saying what his class said. But in particular, he was anti those liberals who happened to be Jewish, one of whom was a real bane of his existence, a bachelor lawyer called Edward Lasker. And I want to quote this little episode because it's very characteristic of Bismarck. Lasker, on the 5th of January 1884, when he was visiting his brother in America and was in New York, died on the streets of the city. Andrew Dixon White, who was ambassador in Berlin in the late 1870s and later founded the Cornell University, wrote about this occasion. It's a nice quote. "Though an Israelite, he showed none of the grasping propensities often ascribed to his race. He seemed to care nothing for wealth or show. He lived simply and devoted himself to the public good as he understood it. A great funeral was given him, and of all the ceremonies I have ever seen, this one was remarkable for its simplicity and beauty. Mr. Karl Schurz and myself were appointed to make addresses on the occasion in the Temple of the Israelites on Fifth Avenue, and we both agreed in thinking that we had never seen a ceremony of the kind more appropriate to a great statesman." End of quote. And by the way, that Israelite temple Emmanuel, is still on Fifth Avenue. The House of Representatives of the United States, on the 9th of January 1884, and I quote, "Having heard of the death of the German statesman Dr. Edward Lasker while a visit in the United States, adopted a resolution declaring, 'His loss is not to be mourned alone by the people of his native land, where his firm and courteous and constant exposition of and devotion to free and liberal ideas have materially advanced the social, political, and economic condition of these people, but not just these people, but by lovers of liberty throughout the world,' unquote. Dixon White wrote, "The resolution was, quote, adopted unanimously and in perfect good faith. Every person present supposing that it would be welcomed by the German government as a friendly act. But the result was astounding. Bismarck took it upon himself, when the resolution reached him, to treat it with contempt and sent it back without laying it before his government, thus giving the American people to understand that they had interfered in a manner which did not concern them. For a time, this seemed likely to provoke a bitter outbreak of anti-American feeling," unquote. Now, the case of Lasker illuminates Bismarck's violence against his enemies. And thanks to the new edition of his works, I was able to piece together much more of the story than was available before. On the 26th of January, 1884, and this is a really important aspect of his character, that's why I spent some time on it. On the 28th of January, 1884, Lasker's funeral took place in the famous Oranienburg Synagogue in Berlin, which Bismarck, by the way, had honored with his presence when it was dedicated in 1866. On the 26th of January, when we got the date, Bismarck sent a telegram to Geheimrat Franz von Rothenburg, the head of the Chancellor's office, in which he ordered that nobody from the government was to go to Lasker's funeral. When 5 members of the cabinet specifically asked Bismarck for his permission to attend, he said no. Ludwig Bamberger, who was a Jewish member of parliament and the founder of the Deutsche Bank, famous Deutsche Bank, wrote in his diary, "Today, Lasker's funeral. No minister, no member of the Bundesrat, not one high civil servant, neither Friedberg nor Achenbach, not even the Swiss minister, Roth, apparently ordre du Mufti." Bismarck's hatred for his enemies, especially in certain aristocratic circles, prevented his son Herbert from marrying Princess Elizabeth von Carbolat, because along with her 2 sisters, she belonged to a group of socialites whom Bismarck loathed and deeply submitted. He destroyed his son's happiness, aided by the ferocity of his wife, who kept a card file on enemies, rather than let him marry the women whom he loved. His famous memoirs are filled with gratuitous attacks on minor figures in the past, long dead and forgotten, against whom he still bore a grudge. I recall from my first lectures on Bismarck a picture in Gordon Craig's wonderful The Politics of the Prussian Army of General Albrecht von Rohm. Stern-looking figure, but something quite delightful. And I always wondered who he was, and I found out about him when I started doing research on this book. Clemens Theodor Pertus, a professor of law in Bonn and close friend of Rohn's, wrote to him in April of 1864, blaming him for having engineered the appointment of a man, I quote, "who calculates so coldly, who prepares so cunningly, and who has no scruples about method," unquote. Rohn thought about this for a couple of weeks, and then he replied, I quote, "Bismarck is an extraordinary man, whom I can certainly help, whom I can support, here and there, correct, but never replace. Yes, he would not be in the place he now has without me. That is an historical fact. But even with that help, he was always himself. To construct the parallelogram of forces correctly, and then the diagonal, that is to say, that which has already happened, and then assess the nature and weight of the effective forces, which one cannot know precisely, that is the work of historic genius, who confirms that by combining it all." End of quote. Ingratitude is not exactly the word to describe Bismarck's final assessment of Albrecht von Rohm in his memoirs. Rohm died on the 27th of 1879. As Rohm knew, and everybody close to the crown knew, Rohm had put Bismarck in power. Rohn's persistence with the king between 1859 and 1862 secured Bismarck the chance to become minister-president, and his loyalty through their relationship allowed Bismarck to become what he did. In bad health, in 1872, with severe asthma and very tired, Rohm answered Bismarck's call to become minister-president in Prussia in 1872, splitting the offices of chancellor and minister-president to allow Bismarck to indulge himself in his very extreme hypochondria and the usual theatrical resignation. There were 11, by the way, in the 26 years under William I. Of Albrecht von Rohm, to whom he literally owed his career, he wrote the following in his Gedanken und Erinnerungen. I quote, "Rohm was the most competent of my colleagues. I could not get along with others. He treated them as a regiment which he marched too long. The colleagues in due course complained about this, and I had to take over the Ministry of State again." Unquote. That's what he says. Yet this same Bismarck not only loved his friends, but many of them loved him in spite of his behavior, and they continued to love him. John Lothrop Motley, the American undergraduate roommate, remained Bismarck's close friend until his untimely death in 1877, as did little Hans von Kleist, Bismarck's closest friend, with whom he had a political falling out, continued to love him until Bismarck died. General Leopold von Gerlach, who had been Bismarck's patron in the 1850s and conduit to King Frederick William IV, a devout evangelical Christian, could not get on with Bismarck's lack of principle. And in 1860, he wrote his last letter to Bismarck before he died. The final lines are, and I quote, "Forgive me that I have closed this letter at random." English in the original. "I do not count on a meeting, but remain always with sincere love, your old friend, L. von G." Bismarck replied to his mentor and patron on the 2nd of May, 1860, and it cannot be much solace to the old man. It begins, "You want to have nothing to do with Bonaparte or Cavour as a matter of principle. I want to avoid France and Sardinia, not because I think it wrong, but because in the interests of our security, I consider them very dubious allies. Who rules in France or Sardinia, once the powers have been recognized, is absolutely unimportant. A matter of fact, not right and wrong. Because one cannot play chess if 16 of the 64 squares are forbidden from the beginning." Unquote. I think that is the best example I know of what Bismarck meant by realpolitik. No emotion, no feelings of hatred or whatever foreign powers, they're all there to be worked with. And that was the end of his relationship with the old patron. In the 1870s, he affronted Leopold's brother, Ernst von Gerlach, and the majority of the Prussian members who had helped him to power, most of whom were devout Christians, when he changed his politics to attack the role of Christianity in Prussian public administration and schools. When the conservative newspaper, the Kreuzzeitung, dared to criticize him, he lashed out against it in Parliament. On the 26th of February, 1876, 400 of these famous scions of old Prussian Junkerdom signed a collective letter to Bismarck, and they all ostentatiously renewed their subscription. Well, he didn't need him anymore. He was now the great Bismarck, a prince and an immortal, and so long as he had the support of the king, he did not need any other allies. So that's what I have to say about him as a human being, about whom I still feel emotionally, profoundly ambivalent. Now to the politics. After the 3 great military victories, Bismarck became a national hero. Raised from country squire to count after the defeat of the Austrians, from count to prince after the stunning victory over France. They took Napoleon III prisoner, and they destroyed the Second Empire. For the next 20 years, Bismarck ruled Germany almost alone, and did so with his characteristic dash and brutality. During the 1890s, after his retirement, and rather to his surprise, he had become genuinely popular. What did the admirers see in him? And I'm very grateful to Dr. Morgenstern and Dr. Urbach for having this display here. I don't have to have a visual aid, do I? That's the image. Often with a glittering pickelhaube on his head, but always in uniform and always looking stern, hardly ever smiling. But in spite of the uniforms, Bismarck was never a real soldier. In 1838, Bismarck wrote to his father that he'd been trying to avoid the draft, a letter which was omitted from the official publications of the collected works in the 1920s and 30s. He told his father that he had not yet begun his military service because he'd made one last attempt to get out of it. Quote, "As a result of muscular weakness, which I explained came from a sword cut out of the right arm, which I feel when I lifted. Unfortunately, the blow was not deep enough." So he was drafted. When he became ambassador to the court of the Tsar, he felt ashamed that he would have to show up in the uniform of a lieutenant in the reserves, a bit like showing up in the Pennsylvania National Guard uniform or something of that kind. And he insisted on having a uniform of some kind or another, made a tremendous fuss, and eventually, in order to keep him from being embarrassed at the court of the Tsar, they made him a major in a local regiment. And he still wasn't happy. Eventually, he had various kinds of generals uniforms. But he was always a civil servant. And because of his status as a civilian, he did not have direct access to the emperor. He had to go through Rome, because as the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, Rome to have always immediate access to. The hybrid constitution of 1850, the so-called oktroyierte Verfassung, the imposed constitution, gave the king the power to command the armed forces and the right to make war and peace. That guaranteed Bismarck his 3 wars and his diplomacy, without any interference from anybody else except the emperor. The constitution, drafted in haste while the revolutionary activity still threatened, had some holes in it. It did not have a provision for a prime minister, called the minister-president. In 1852, the then minister-president, Otto von Bismarck, got the king to approve a cabinet order on September the 8th, 1852, which gave the minister-president the right to control which of his members of the cabinet had access to the king. It was that over which Bismarck was dismissed in 1890, that he would not allow his ministers to go to the new Emperor William II. And Bismarck wrote in his resignation letter, which he was writing while the new government was actually moving in, that order alone, I quote, gave me the authority which made that level of responsibility for the collective policies of the cabinet possible, unquote. The great Bismarck then fell from power as a result of a legal dispute about the constitutionality of the rights of the minister-president of Prussia. Now, the political legacy undermines, I think, the picture of the great statesman. And I'm going to argue very briefly, because I see I have a much thicker text than you have any reason to suffer through. The immediate domestic failure arose, ironically, from his most important success. Bismarck was appointed minister-president. The whole of the country was shocked. He had a reputation of such extreme right-wing fanaticism that it was assumed that the king had only appointed him in order to cause a final crisis with the parliament and restore martial law. Otherwise, nobody else would remotely have appointed such a raving right-wing nut. Bismarck's famous first speech, which contained the phrase, "Not by speeches and majority votes are the great questions of the day decided," that was the mistake of 1848 and 49, but by blood and iron. And that's where the phrase, the Iron Chancellor, comes from. A speech made 1 week after his appointment. You can imagine what the political effect was, even among potential supporters. The great historian Treitschke wrote, and I quote, "You know how passionately I love Prussia. But when I hear so shallow a country squire as this Bismarck bragging about the iron and blood with which he intends to subdue Germany, the meanness of it seems to be exceeded only by its absurdity," unquote. That opinion was pretty well universal. Bismarck discovered in 1863 that he was indeed the most hated person in Germany. In the summer of 1863, the Emperor Franz Joseph, the Emperor of Austria, called a meeting in August of 1863 of all the German princes, the object of which was to sit down and write a new constitution for a united Germany. I think this is the single most important turning point in Bismarck's career, and possibly in European history, although it's hardly known today. Now, it's plausible that they would have arrived at it. And in any case, they would have certainly arrived at some sort of constitution without 3 major wars and all the subsequent things that happened. Bismarck recognized at once that this was the greatest possible threat to his plans, because these plans had already been announced, although he had no right to do so, in 1862 when he paid a visit to London. I quote from Disraeli's notes about this occasion. Bismarck, who knew the Russian ambassador very well, he'd been the ambassador of Russia, showed up in London in June of 1862, completely uncertain as to whether he would be appointed. And this is what he told the Russian ambassador, the Saxon ambassador, and Disraeli, who was then in opposition. Quote, "I shall soon be compelled to undertake the conduct of the Prussian government. My first care will be to reorganize the army with or without the help of the Landtag. As soon as the army shall have been brought into such a condition as to inspire respect, I shall seize the first best pretext to declare war against Austria, dissolve the German Diet, subdue the minor states, and give national unity to Germany under Prussian leadership. I have come here to say this to the Queen's ministers, unquote. Summer of 1862. He had no guarantee that he would be appointed to that stage. He certainly had no right to have a say in the reform of the army. It wasn't a civilian's business. And the rest was just astonishing. On the way home, Disraeli accompanied Count Riedstrom, the ambassador, to his residence. And as they parted, Disraeli said to him, "Take care of that man. He means what he says." And he did. So he knew what he wanted from the beginning. Therefore, the threat to his position, which a constitutional convention called by the emperor, was very, very serious to him. They sent the King of Saxony to invite the king to come. And they had the first of the really great, what I think of as father and son rows about what the king was supposed to do. I quote from Bismarck's memoirs. "My master did not find it easy to resist that move. He reflected over and over again, quote, 30 reigning princes and a king to carry their messages, unquote. Besides, he loved and honored the King of Saxony, who moreover of all the princes had personally most vocation for such a mission. Not until midnight did I succeed in obtaining the king's signature to refusal to the King of Saxony. When I left my master, both he and I were ill and exhausted by the nervous tension of the situation. But the crisis was overcome." End of quote. That was only the first of dozens of occasions in the ensuing 26 years where the king gave in to Bismarck. And it seems to me that this relationship is actually the key to understanding the whole of Bismarck's career. Not least because the old man, who was 65, doesn't seem so old to me now, who was 65 when he appointed Bismarck, lived for another 26 years. So for 26 years, no matter how the king felt, no matter how often they were in tears, Bismarck always won. And the fact that he always won made his career possible. If the king had died at 70, Bismarck's career would have been over just like that, because the liberal crown prince, and even more the liberal crown princess, the crown princess Victoria of England, would have gotten rid of Bismarck just like that, to the enthusiastic applause of liberals all over Germany. Now Bismarck was in the suit. The king said, "Well, you've done this, you have to answer." On the 15th of September, 1863, the Prussian government replied to the invitation of the emperor with a series of conditions. The first of which was a true national assembly which emerges from direct participation of the entire nation. Only such a representative system will give Russia the security that it is nothing to sacrifice, which will not benefit the whole of Germany. Unquote. The extreme reactionary suddenly popped up as a Democrat. The shock was so tremendous. My favorite quote is the Leipziger Nachricht. She said, "It's a bit like Mephistopheles showing up in church and climbing onto the pulpit and reading a lesson." Now this then gave Bismarck the power to do what he did. But he was now stuck with the promise of universal suffrage, and he had to fulfill it. What he did was, in fact, to include in the first German constitution, the North German Constitution of 1867, precisely that. The lower house of this new federation was to be direct, universal manhood suffrage. When Germany was unified in 1870, the same clause went into the new constitution. What was the result? The result was that by the 1870s, by the 1880s, the Constitution filled up with the Reichstag filled up with Social Democrats and with Catholics, people whom Bismarck regarded as enemies of the Reich. In the meantime, he preserved the old Prussian Constitution intact, which survived to 1918. And that gave to the top 5% of income taxpayers in Prussia the right to elect a third of the deputies, and left to the 85% in the third class the right to elect a third of the deputies. The upper house was already a House of Lords, which meant that all kinds of things could not happen in Prussia. So the Prussian House of Lords and the Reichstag eventually became for Bismarck really, really very difficult. The 25,000 heads, as Friedrich Neumann called them, Junker families, ran an industrial nation between the 1870s and 1918, and even during the First World War, a People's War, when the Kaiser begged the Prussians to undo the three-class voting and to introduce universal suffrage in Prussia, they refused to do it. So in a sense, by the end of his career, Bismarck was actually, 17 days before he was dismissed by William II, 17 days exactly, he called a cabinet meeting in which he said, we are going to abolish universal suffrage. After all, he said, it's a compact of the princes. If they come together and decide to undo this constitution, they've got a perfect constitutional right to do it. Members of the cabinet were stunned, and Bismarck was out of office before people tried to see him. So I think one could say, not unfairly, that the law of unintended consequences made it impossible for Bismarck to operate with the right tongue after the late 1880s. Foreign policy, I think, presents another, but I think equally difficult inheritance. Foreign affairs pleased him, and he was very good at them. In foreign affairs, he practiced his famous realpolitik, pragmatic power politics, no causes, no emotions, no ideologies, no preconditions, with utter realism. As he said, die Politik hat nicht zu rechnen, was geschehen ist, sondern zu sorgen, dass es nicht wieder geschehe. Politics is not about taking revenge for what has happened, but taking care that it does not happen again. After 1870, he called Germany a satiated state. It was to be one of three as long as Europe was divided into five great powers. After the Austro-Prussian War, with all the strength at his command, and he had by this stage a lot, he prevented the king from a victory parade through Vienna and from undue reparations. As he wrote to his wife, if we don't exaggerate our claims and do not believe that we have conquered the world, we can arrive at a peace worth the effort. We are so quickly intoxicated as we become downhearted, and I have the thankless task of pouring cold water into the bubbling wine and reminding people that we do not live alone in Europe, but with many neighbors. Unfortunately, he did not follow this advice after the Franco-Prussian War. He negotiated the peace treaty arrangements, the armistice and the peace treaty, all by himself, with only a secretary. He didn't take any advice. And this time, he imposed a huge reparation debt on the new French Republic, 5 billion gold marks, and he agreed to the popular clamor, and Germany annexed two French provinces, Alsace and Lorraine. The result of this was, first, that the huge amount of money which the French had to pay led to a bubble, the kind of thing that we're only too familiar with, and then a bust, which led to the Great Depression from 1873 to 1896. And Alsace-Lorraine became the one unmovable point in French politics. They would not make a deal with Germany as long as the Germans sat on Alsace-Lorraine. So already 16 out of the 64 squares are blocked in advance. As the century went on and the Ottoman Empire began to disintegrate and Islam became for the first time a serious problem in European politics, the conflict between Russia and Austria-Hungary over control of the Balkans, which was a kind of power vacuum, became more and more acute. Bismarck found his two conservative allies being pulled apart, and he couldn't stop it. In 1878, after the Russo-Turkish War, he called a peace conference. And the peace conference was probably the highest point in his career. Here was Bismarck at the center of Europe, directing everything, and writing all the dispatches, speaking in 3 languages. Brilliant. The honest broker. But the honest broker ended up by taking away some of the gains that the Tsars had won in their war against the Turks, for which he was not forgiven. So already the gap between his two conservative allies, the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Russian Empire, is beginning to widen. Bismarck tried to get around this in the 1870s by the Three Emperors League and by various other devices, and many, many different kinds of treaties of great complexity, which I think I'm still capable of reciting in order, but it's a bit like one of those things that you learn in an exam and it oozes out when you walk out of the room. By 1887, he had to find a way to renew the Russian German alliance. But he just signed an alliance with the Austrians and the Western powers to guarantee the status quo in the Mediterranean, and it was the main issue of Russian foreign policy then and now to get warm water ports in the Mediterranean. He signed a secret treaty with the Russians, called the Reinsurance Treaty later, in which he promised the Russians what he had promised the Austrians. Now, I don't know what you call this, but it's not. Only somebody as secure in his position as Bismarck was would even try this. But in my view, it's already a sign of the failure of Bismarck's foreign policy. Because what he had done in 1879 to secure the Austrians was to make an alliance with them. So he now had an international situation in which half the squares are blocked. Austria-Hungary is an ally, France is an enemy, and so German policy has to vacillate between Britain and Russia. He hoped that with Disraeli he'd be able to get something. We don't know quite why it didn't happen. Once Disraeli was gone and Gladstone came, no hope there. And Alexander III was certainly not a fan of Bismarck the way Alexander II had been. So vacillating between Britain and Russia. When the new government came in, with Leo von Caprivi as chancellor and Marshal von Bieberstein as foreign secretary, and Holstein showed them the reinsurance treaty, they were stunned. What could they do? They said, we can't possibly do this. We absolutely can't possibly do this. Maybe Bismarck could have got away with it, not us. So they allowed the treaty to lapse, and sure enough, 2 or 3 years later, Russia and France made the alliance, which later on became the Entente in the First World War. And Bismarck honored this thing by, in 1896, publishing it in the Hamburger Nachricht. Anybody else than Bismarck would have been sent to jail for treason. He published a secret state treaty. So I think here too, one has to say that his attempts to maintain the balance of power favorable to Germany simply did not work. And by 1890, foreign policy, from the German point of view, has gone into a kind of closed situation, and domestic policy done the same. And I would say in domestic affairs that Bismarck bequeathed to the German state 2 non-functioning parliaments. The Prussian parliament, which he preserved in its 1850 form, and the Reichstag, which he had designed to suit him. When he fell from power and left Berlin on the 20th of March, 1890, when Bismarck resigned on the 20th of March, 1890, he left a day. Hildegard von Spitzenberg, my favorite informant, sat down to think through the causes of Bismarck's fall from power and recorded her thoughts in her diary. And I'd like to read you this really wonderful passage. It's analysis of what's going on. Let's have the page to turn. I quote, "A series of necessary laws fell onto the table because they did not suit his private interests as a landlord or simply because he had no time for them. As far as the family is concerned, nemesis breaks over them, not unjustly, for the brutality and heartlessness which they trampled on so many people, great and small, into the dust. But the prospect will not be pleasant. My God, the vulgarity which will now show itself after the servility of early days." Unquote. On the 29th of March 1890, Bismarck left the Wilhelmstrasse and took the train from the Lehrter Bahnhof to Friedrichsruhe, where his institute now is. A huge crowd of dignitaries, ministers, regiments, full dress, and crowds lined the street. Ludwig Bamberger noted in his diary, "Departure today. The Bismarck legend begins." Why Bismarck matters then has been my theme, and I hope I've shown that he matters hugely. 9 years after his appointment as Minister-President of Prussia, the victory parade passed through Berlin after the stupendous Prussian triumph over France in the Franco-Prussian War and the proclamation of a German Empire in the euphoria of that success. These 9 years, and the revolution, as Disraeli called it, constitute the greatest diplomatic and political achievement by any leader in the last 2 centuries. But Bismarck accomplished this all without commanding a single soldier, without dominating a vast parliamentary majority, without the support of a mass movement, without any previous experience of government, without the charisma of a great orator, and in the face, at least initially, of national revulsion at his name and its reputation. This achievement is the work of a political genius of a very unusual kind, and it rested on several conflicting characteristics, among which brutal, disarming honesty mingled often with the wiles and deceits of a confidence man. He played his part with perfect confidence, yet mixed them with rage, anxiety, illness, hypochondria, and irrationality. The 20 years after the victory tell another story. His attack on the Catholic Church and the Kulturkampf ended in defeat. His foreign policy, in spite of his diplomatic adroitness, ended in an encircled Germany surrounded by enemies. His domestic policies went to liberalism to conservatism after 1878, but it was a conservatism of tariffs and business interests. He became involved in battles over imports of American pork, and increasingly bitter parliamentary battles over often minor issues. His health deteriorated badly, and he spent more time away from Berlin than in it. He trained no successor. And after Herbert von Bismarck betrayed Princess von Karlat, his elder son became socially and politically unacceptable in general society. In short, his domestic policy was to preserve his own power and that of the monarch on which it rested. When that monarch died, he had no political base. I conclude. Bismarck's Reich was what the Germans call eine Fehlkonstruktion, a failed construction. By preserving the supreme command of the Prussian kings, he ensured that no collegial body of ministers could function. Germany alone, among the powers on the eve of the First World War, had no council, not even the Austro-Hungarians had a crown council, and so did the Russian. Only the emperor could bring the army and navy together, and that's another long story, but the army and navy did not cooperate. They did not know what the other strategy was. Only William II could have brought them together, and he didn't. When Lord Haldane visited Berlin to negotiate a compromise in the naval arms race in 1912, he found chaos, sheer chaos. Now something controversial. The Eurozone is also eine Fehlkonstruktion. It's a failed structure. And it's born of an anxiety not unlike Bismarck's. Helmut Kohl's anxiety about the new, powerful Germany in Europe. Kohl worried about that a lot. He was a Rhineland Catholic, and the Prussians were coming back again. A single currency, without a system to rebalance the domestic economies when they diverge, and with fiscal policy still in the hands of the 19 member states, simply cannot work. What Southern Europe needs is a Marshall Plan under German leadership, and the German government will not permit it. Germany has never been, I think, and is not today, at ease with its position of hegemony in Europe from 1870 to 2015, and it is still not comfortable. Bismarck knew what he had achieved, and it frightened him. All those close to him said he was haunted by the cauchemar des coalitions, the nightmare coalitions against Germany, by the threat that his Fehlkonstruktion would somehow fall apart and his achievement disgrace. After 1870, those close to him, all noticed the anxiety that Bismarck lived with, that his creation would not survive. And that persistent anxiety about Germany's hegemony in Europe is why Bismarck still matters today. Thank you very much.